Sachas Bava Kamma Daf Yud Aleph continues the Gemara's discussion about the nevela, that is the carcass of the animal that died because it was attacked or because it fell in a bar. Who has to deal with that? Whose responsibility is it to deal with that? And the Gemara has said that the issue there really is who takes the loss from the time of the death of the animal to the time that the payment is actually completed, because the mazik, if it's the mazik's responsibility, the mazik could use it to pay his bill. He could use whatever he wants to pay his bill, any movable object. So he could give the nevela for sure. But if it's the mazik's responsibility, then he can only count it for value at the time that he gives it to the nizik. If it's a nizik's responsibility, then the loss is a nizik's problem, and therefore the nizik takes it at the time that the death actually happened. So now the Gemara wants to say it's actually a machlekes tanoim. The Gemara brings a brisa, which has a machlekes between Bava Kamma and Abba Shaul. How do you explain the pasuk discussing a situation where a shomer sachar is watching an animal and it gets attacked and eaten by a wolf, or gets attacked and killed by a wolf? How do you explain the pasuk that says im taref yiveyu eid? So the Tana Kamma says Yeveyu Eid means you bring a witness that you were an Oynis, and your Pater Shemasacher doesn't have to pay for Oinsin. Abba Shaul says Eid means Aduda, which means the carcass, and it says bring the carcass to Beis Din, and the meaning is that we'll evaluate it and we'll see how much it's worth, meaning how much it was worth at the time that it was killed, and that's how much we consider the nizik to still be owning, and then you only have to add payment from that to the original value. Now, obviously, he's not talking about if it was an einus, because if it would be an einus, Shemazach wouldn't have to pay. So he's talking about it was a pshia. Now, the Gemara says, what are they arguing over? Obviously, Abba Shaul holds that we say that the carcass is a nizik's responsibility, and therefore he wants to explain the pasuk is referring to a case where you're chayiv, and it says bring the carcass to Beis Din so that we can evaluate it and consider that money already paid to the nizik, and then the mazik only has to pay for the rest. Why does Tana Kamma not agree with that? Because he holds it's not possible to say that, because the nizik is not responsible for the carcass. Therefore, he has to say that it's just talking about bring a witness, and it's talking about a case where it was an oynis and where you're not chayiv. So therefore, the machlekes is about who's responsible to deal with the carcass. So Gemara says it's not the pshat. There's a different machlekes here, and that is who has to haul the nevela away. Who's the one who needs to pay for hauling? And what Abba Shaul was saying was bring it to Beis Din. He was saying it's the mazik's responsibility to haul it. What the Tana Kamma was saying was that it's not the mazik's responsibility to haul it, and therefore it doesn't mean bring the carcass. It means bring a witness. Now Abaye asked, I don't understand. Why are we discussing who has to haul it? We should subtract the holing from the valuation. Let's say it's in a hole. So at the bottom of the hole, it's worth 1 zuz. At the top of the hole, it's worth 4 zuz, because you have to pay 3 zuz to schlep it out of the hole. So then the valuation of the carcass will change, and the mazik therefore ends up getting less valuation out of it when he gives it to the nizik. So if it's at the bottom of the hole, he just ends up having to pay more. So either way, the mazik ends up having to pay for it. So why do we need to teach halacha who has to schlep it out of the hole? All right, if the mazik wants to schlep it out of the hole, it'll be worth 4 zuz, and you can subtract that from the total amount he needs to pay. If he doesn't want to schlep it out of the hole, it'll be worth 1 zuz, and you can only subtract that from the amount that he needs to pay. So our answer is no, it's really worth the same amount in the hole and out of the hole. It doesn't become worth more when you schlep it out of the hole, even though you have to pay for hauling. Samar says, really? Why should that be? Samar says, yeah, this is an expression that people say a beam of wood is worth the same amount in the city as it is out of the city. The valuation doesn't change just because you need to pay to move it. The Gemara now discusses, do you evaluate the carcass for other people who owe? Is it only for the mazik that we say he can count the carcass as part of the payment that he owes, or even for others? What cases? So a ganif, a gazlan, or a shoyl. That's what we speak about. If you steal something, or if you borrow it and it gets ruined and now you have to give back the value, can you give back the carcass and just add money, or do you have to give back a complete new valuable one in the first place? So the Gemara quotes Shmuel. So Shmuel says for the ganef and the gazlan, you have to give back a new one. The Beis Din will not evaluate it for you and allow you to just add money onto that. Only for Nezikin do we evaluate the carcass. And then he says, and I say the same thing applies to the borrower for the shayl. And Rav, who he calls Abba, Rav agrees to me. So Gemara says, well, when he says, I say also the shayl, it means also the shayl is like the ganef and the gazlan that we do not add, or also the shayl is like the nezikin and we do count the value of the carcass. So the Gemara says, well, he said Rav agrees to him, and we know what Rav holds. Because we have a case that somebody borrowed an axe and he broke it, and he came to Rav and he said, give him a new one. So you see that if for a borrower you have to give the new one, you can't take the value of the broken one. So Gemara says, the opposite is true, because what happened there was Rav Kahana and Rav Asi said to Rav, is that really the halacha? And he was quiet. So you see that he agreed that really you do not have to give a new one. You can give back the broken one and add money. Now, the Gemara says, Ula said name of Rav Elazar that we do evaluate even for the ganef and the gazlan. And Rav Papi said we do not. And the halacha is we do not. Not for the ganef, not for the gazlan, but for the shoyel, we do, like what Rav Kahana and Rav Asi said to Rav.
Now, this was a halacha brought by Ula in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Now the Gemara brings a list of other halachos unrelated, except that they were also said by Ula in the name of Rabbi Elazar. So the first one concerns the topic of a shilya, that is the placenta, when it comes out of a woman's womb. Does that count as a birth or not? Now, the shilya itself does not metami a woman tumas leida. A woman who gives birth has tumas leida. For a boy, that's 7 days. For a girl, it's 14 days. After which she is metaher, and anything that comes out afterwards is tahar for the next short while. The question is, a placenta, it itself is not a birth, but a placenta often has the fetus with it. And even though you don't see the fetus, we assume that it got melted or dissolved, and that's why you don't see it. We have a rule, in shilya b'lei vlad, if you see the placenta, you assume that there's a birth of a child there as well. And the Gemara discusses what happens if you have the placenta that comes out partially in one day and partially in the next day. In which day do you assume the fetus came out, and which day starts the tumas leida? So Ula says, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, you start from the first day. So Rabbi says, why? Because you want to go l'chumrah. Maybe the majority of the vlad, the majority of the fetus came out the first day, and the day that the majority of it comes out is the day that begins the tumas leida. So Rava says, but that's a kula, because if you're going to start a day earlier, you're going to end the day earlier. So Rava therefore says it's not that you're going to start counting the 14 days of Tumah, which, because you have to be machmer, that it might have been a girl, and therefore there's 14 days. You're not going to start counting a day earlier. You're not going to assume that it was the first day. You'll be machmer on the first day, and then actually start counting from the second day, and end up counting a total of 15 days misafik. So the Gemara asks, so what's the chiddush in that? Because you're saying that there is no shilya, there's no placenta without a vlad, and even if you have only part of the placenta, you have to assume that the majority of the vlad was there. We already know those two halachas. We know them from a discussion, a mishnah, discussing a animal that gives birth, or an animal that expels a placenta, and there the halacha is that we assume that the placenta came out with the vlad, and therefore it's aser b'achila even if you shech the animal. Now, had it been inside when you slaughtered the mother, that slaughtering would count on the child as well. That's the halacha. Slaughtering when the mother counts on the child, but only while it's inside. Once it came out, then it's not. And there the halacha is that even if part of the shilya comes out, the entire vlad is aser to be eaten, because we assume the majority of it came out, even though part of the shilya came out as well. So therefore, you see the halacha, that even though there's only part of the shilya is out, you assume the majority of the vlad is out. Here you're saying the same thing, part of the shilya is out, you assume the majority of the vlad is out, and that's where the tumah begins. It's the same halacha. The Brisa concludes there that you have the same simin that a shilya is, that the vlad is out. In an animal, same thing applies to a human. So the Gemara answers, no, you don't see that halacha there, because there could have been a gzeira. It could be really, we don't assume that the part of the shilya is a sign that the majority of the vlad is out. We assume that it is not majority out. However, we make a gzeira that may get confused With a situation in which it is definitely completely out, and you therefore have to make a Gzeira Atu. Here, though, we would make a Gzeira Atu because people will see from the fact that you're keeping the laws of Tumah for one day later that you're not assuming that the Shulya is fully out. And in a different situation where it is only a question of partially coming out or not, you would not automatically assume the clue that it was fully out. The next halacha brought by Ula B'Shem Rabbi Elazar is that of a Bechor, firstborn. It's talking about a person who requires Pidyon Haben. What happens if the child is killed and does not survive to be a month old? Now, if he were to die on his own, he for sure would not require Pidyon Haben because he obviously wasn't viable. He didn't live to be a month old. But here he could have lived, just something happened that caused him to die earlier. So do you require a Pidyon Haben after that or not? The halacha is, says Ula Omar Rabbi Elazar, that he does not. And it goes around Bava Kamma says the same thing. The Havamina that you would have, because it says Padoi Tifteh, the double lashon would include an extra type of situation. And you may think it's referring to this case, Kamash Malan, that it says Ach, which means that it excludes this case, and you do not have to do a Pidyon Ben in that case. Next, the halacha of Ula Amar Elazar is how you do a kinyan, how you transfer ownership of a behema Gasa, a large animal. So Ula says that it is Meshicha, by pulling it towards you. So Gemara asks that we have a mission in Kedushin that says that it's Mesira. You hand over control by giving the reins or the halter over to the person who is being a it. So this doesn't fit with that. Gemara says it's a Machlik Tanaim. There's a brisa where the Chachamim say both a Gasa and a Zaka are with Meshicha. And Rabbi Shimon says that both are with Hagba'ah, making it go upwards by climbing onto a shelf or a pile of branches or something along those lines. Next, halacha is when brothers are dividing up the father's estate for the inheritance. What do they evaluate? What do they bring to court to evaluate as part of the estate? So they bring all the property that the father had, but what the children, the other children in the family are wearing, their clothing, they don't have to bring, they don't have to evaluate that because they agree. They're not going to schlep the kids to Bezin to evaluate the clothing that they're wearing. And therefore they're meichel that value. Says Rav Papa, though the clothing that they themselves are wearing, they do evaluate. There is one situation in which they don't, and that's if there is a clearly older brother who represents the family and speaks for them. They all agree that he needs to have fine clothing, and he can keep that for himself, and they all are meichel that to him, and they don't need to evaluate that. The next halacha is that of a shomer shemasel shomer. If you have given over your property to somebody to watch or to guard, then he gives it over to someone else, and something happens to it. Is the first shomer who you appointed responsible? Or is he not responsible, and the second one is the one who's responsible? So here you have Rabbi Elazar quoted by Ula actually in a machlokes with Rava. So Ula says the first shomer is not responsible, and it doesn't matter if the second shomer is a higher level shmira or a lower level shmira. If it's a higher level shmira, that is, let's say the first shomer was not getting paid, and you give it to someone who is getting paid, so he's supposed to work harder and do a better shmira, there, certainly, the first shomer shouldn't be responsible because he increased the level of shmir on it. But even if he made it lower, like the first shomer was getting paid and the second shomer is not getting paid, still he's not responsible. And the reason is because he gave it to an intelligent person, and that's considered to be responsible. You give it to someone, there's nothing wrong with the fact you give it over to someone else to watch. Now, Rava disagrees, and Rava says either way, whether you give it to somebody who has greater responsibilities or someone who has less responsibilities, either way the original shomer is responsible. He can't get over to someone else and patra himself because the original owner could say, I gave it to you because I trust you to swear that nothing happened to it. I don't trust that guy, and therefore the responsibility stays with you. You can't pass it off on someone else. The next halacha, the final one for this daf, continues in a sugya deep into the next daf. We'll start it here. Ula says the name of Rav Elazar, you can collect avadim. That is, if someone owes you money, and he has property, he owns avadim, and he sells those avadim, you can collect those avadim, you can take them away from the one who bought the avadim, just like you can collect land. There's a lien on land, there's also a lien on avadim. So Gemara says, Rav Nachman asked Ula, this that you're quoting Rav Elazar, was he referring to collecting from the Baal Chayv himself, or if he died and you're collecting from his inheritors, from the Yisraelim? So he said from himself. So he said from himself, it's not a chiddush. From himself, you could collect even the shirt off the back of the guy. So what's a chiddush you could collect from his avadim? So he said the chiddush is we're talking about where you sold it. He was made as an apoitiki, which means that he designated to the person who's collecting, you can only collect from this, and then he went and sold it. So he doesn't collect from anything else. Instead, he collects from this eved that got sold, and the person who bought the eved loses. And the reason is that in eved, people know when you sell the eved, and you should have been careful not to buy it to make sure that there is no lien on it. However, if it was an animal that was made into an apoitiki, which means you can be that he told the Bachav you can only collect from this animal, then he went and sold it. He can't collect from it. There is no call. The person who bought it could not have known that it was an apoitiki, and therefore he has to go collect from somewhere else.